She was always the quiet one. Even as a child, she listened more than she spoke. Not to people, but to echoes. The Jedi Temple was filled with them. Footsteps lost in stone halls, whispers sealed in holocrons. The silence of statues that had outlived 1,000 wars. Atris was raised among the dead. She believed the Force lived in memory, not action, in discipline, in stillness. While other children sparred in the courtyards, Atris sat beneath the statues. She memorized their faces, their names, their legacies. They weren't just Jedi to her. They were warnings. Every fall, every betrayal, every exile, she studied them like sacred wounds that could never be allowed to reopen. The Masters called her gifted, precise, a guardian of the old ways. But Atris didn't feel gifted. She felt afraid. Afraid of losing what had already been lost. Afraid that the order was changing. Afraid that no one else seemed to care. She believed knowledge was safety. She was wrong. The archives were her sanctuary, and her cage. She recited the code with perfect clarity. She corrected others when they strayed. She kept emotion at a distance even from herself. Especially from herself. When the Mandalorians invaded the Outer Rim, Atris didn't leave the temple. Not because she lacked courage, but because she feared what courage had become. Knights were rushing to war, not out of duty, but out of rage. She saw it in their eyes, in Revan, in Malak, in those who followed them. Even the council couldn't agree. Some waited, some warned, some broke away in silence. Atris stayed and wrote it all down. She believed the Force needed record keepers, not generals. What she didn't see was that history doesn't preserve itself, and silence is not peace. She watched as Jedi became soldiers, as soldiers became tyrants, as the line between savior and destroyer vanished. Atris told herself she was loyal to the order, to the truth, but deep down, she was loyal only to the past. The statues around her had not moved, but the galaxy had, and soon even the archives would begin to burn. Atris never cried, not when she was chosen, not when she failed, not even when she was alone. Tears, she believed, were for those who lacked control, and Atris valued control above all things. She wore her discipline like armor, every movement deliberate, every sentence measured. To the other Jedi, she was cold, but to the Council, she was perfect. She followed the code. She spoke only when necessary. She obeyed the will of the Order. But she was not calm, not truly. Beneath the surface, she trembled, not with anger, not with hate, with fear, not the kind of fear the Sith spoke of, not the kind that shouts. Atris feared quietly, deeply. She feared attachment. She feared chaos. She feared herself, because somewhere, buried under the white robes and ancient texts, she had once felt something, a bond, one she never spoke of, not even in the silence of her chambers. The Jedi Exile. They had trained together, studied together, laughed in moments too short to last. And then, the Mandalorian Wars came, and everything changed. The exile left. Atris stayed, but the severing wasn't clean. It never is. She told herself it was a betrayal, that the exile had defied the code, that they had chosen war over the will of the Force. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was simpler, and far more painful. She missed them, not their skills, not their insights, them. The way they asked questions, the way they listened, the way they made her feel less hollow. But feelings had no place in her life. So she buried them beneath layers of doctrine, beneath judgment, beneath her own voice, grown colder with each passing year. She told herself it was duty, that love was weakness, that letting go was strength. But letting go is not the same as forgetting, and Atris never forgot. Not the smile, not the silence that followed, not the moment the exile turned away and never looked back. That moment stayed. It followed her through trials, through promotions, through the rising storm that would soon consume the Republic. She spoke louder in council chambers. She judged more harshly. She held others to standards even she couldn't meet. Because if she faltered, even for a second, everything she had buried might rise again. And it nearly did. When the war ended, when the Jedi were broken, when the exile returned, Atris felt everything she had locked away. Regret, shame, longing, but she said nothing. She only stared, and in that silence, the old wound opened. She had spent a lifetime hiding her heart, and now she couldn't remember if it was still there. As the war deepened, Atris hardened, not in anger, in certainty. She told herself the Jedi were failing because they were forgetting who they were, forgetting restraint, forgetting obedience, forgetting the past. So she clung to it. Every record, every holocron, every fragment of doctrine written before the galaxy learned to burn. She became more than a historian. She became a gate. What entered the archives passed through her judgment. What was remembered survived by her approval. The council noticed. They trusted her. Too much. When Jedi began to fall, Atris catalogued their names. When worlds were lost, she preserved their last reports. When Revan and Malak turned from heroes into warnings, Atris sealed their early records away. Not to protect them, to control the narrative. She believed truth could be dangerous if handled incorrectly, that some knowledge needed chains, and she believed she was strong enough to hold them. The irony was lost on her. While others debated strategy and morality, Atris argued preservation. She spoke of precedent, of ancient schisms, of the last great Sith wars. She reminded the council how often the Jedi had fallen not to enemies, but to themselves. Her voice was calm, her words precise, her intent unyielding. When younger Jedi questioned her severity, she dismissed them. They lacked perspective, they lacked discipline, they lacked fear. Atris had plenty. She feared another Revan, another Malak, another generation that believed they knew better than history. So she tightened her grip. Access restricted, teachings refined, interpretations narrowed. What she called protection, others quietly called obsession. But no one challenged her openly. Not yet. The war ended badly. Victory came wrapped in devastation. Systems lay in ruin. The Jedi Order returned broken and scattered. And Atris stood amid the wreckage, untouched. She told herself this proved her right. Those who fought had fallen. Those who stayed had endured. She had endured. But endurance is not the same as wisdom. As survivors returned to the temple, Atris watched them closely. She noted their scars, their silences, the way some avoided the archives entirely. She judged them harshly, especially one. The exile had returned, changed, quiet, empty in ways she did not understand. Atris felt something twist inside her. Not relief, not anger, threat. Because the exile did not fear the past. They carried it without chains, and that terrified her. So Atris did what she always did when faced with uncertainty. She closed her hands around truth, around memory, around the order itself. She convinced herself she was protecting the Jedi from collapse. But somewhere, beneath the rules and records, she was protecting herself from doubt, from guilt, from the possibility that control was never the answer. The galaxy had changed, and Atris was running out of places to hide. She wore white, while others dressed in browns and tans. Atris stood apart, always pristine. White robes, white walls, white silence. She believed it made her incorruptible, untouchable, pure. But light does not erase shadows. It creates them, and Atris was casting hers long before she noticed. She stood before the council with perfect posture. Her voice never trembled. Her gaze never wavered. But inside, something had begun to fracture. The exile's return had stirred it. The questions, the memories, the fear. Fear that perhaps she had been wrong. Fear that loyalty to the code had cost her more than she could admit. Fear that silence was not wisdom, but cowardice. And then the council asked her to judge. Not a Sith, not a traitor, a Jedi. The same one she had once trained beside. The same one who had once made her feel human. Now, Atris was told to strip that person of identity, of title, of belonging. She did not hesitate. Her words were sharp, her verdict final. She called it justice, but it felt like vengeance. Even she knew it. After the exile left, she stood alone in the archives, holocrons flickering softly, walls colder than before. She replayed her words again and again, but they didn't comfort her. They echoed, and each time, they sounded more hollow. Atris had believed she was saving the order, preserving truth, protecting light, but truth without empathy becomes cruelty, and light without warmth becomes blinding. She no longer visited the meditation chambers. She no longer sought guidance from the Force. Instead, she listened only to herself, because only her voice still made sense. But the voice was changing. It spoke in absolutes. It whispered warnings. It questioned the motives of those she once trusted. And it grew louder. She began to doubt the other masters, began to see flaws in their logic, weakness in their silence. She began to see herself as the last Jedi who truly understood what the Order was meant to be. That was the moment it began. The shift. It didn't feel like a fall. It felt like clarity, like purpose, like power disguised as duty. She smiled less, spoke more, commanded without blinking. Her eyes were still bright, but something behind them had dimmed. The temple still called her a protector, but she had become something else. A gatekeeper, a judge, a sentinel who no longer trusted those she served. The archives remained clean, but the soul guarding them was changing. Slowly, quietly, irrevocably. She was still the keeper of light, but that light was beginning to burn. The war didn't begin with blasters. It began with silence. When the Mandalorians invaded, the galaxy screamed. But the Jedi Council said nothing. They waited, watched, measured the currents of the Force. And then Revan spoke. He didn't ask for permission. He gave no warning. He simply stood before the Council and said no. No to inaction. No to waiting. No to the wisdom of old men who had outlived their purpose. Atris was there, She saw the way he looked at the masters, not with defiance, but pity, as if they were already ghosts. And then he left. Not alone. Never alone. Others followed him. Younger Jedi. Restless Jedi. Jedi who believed the galaxy needed a sword, not a sermon. Atris didn't move. She stood still, frozen inside the great halls of memory. She told herself Revan was arrogant, that those who followed him had betrayed the code, that action without understanding was the beginning of darkness. But she felt it, the silence he left behind, and within it, something broke. It wasn't just the order that fractured. It was her, because the one who followed Revan, the one she never expected to, was the Exile, the same voice that once laughed with her in the temple, the one who questioned the code but never left it. Until now, Atris waited for a message, a return, anything. Nothing came, not even goodbye. She buried herself in work, updated the archives, documented Jedi casualties, tracked the war from a distance. Her words grew sharper, her robes even whiter, her heart quieter. She watched the reports, the battles, the victories that felt more like warnings. And through it all, she searched for a name. Not Revan, not Malak, just one name. The Exile. She told herself it was duty, that she needed to understand who had left them, who had left her. But it wasn't about understanding. It was about loss, and the silence that followed it. Revan won the war. The Mandalorians were broken. But the cost? The Jedi returned as whispers, hollow, changed, and then Revan vanished into the unknown regions. He came back wearing a mask, came back with a new name, Darth Revan, and behind him, Darth Malak. The Jedi who had disobeyed the Council were now leading the Sith. Atris didn't speak in those meetings. She watched as masters debated guilt, as survivors spoke of horror, as fear replaced certainty. She watched and waited, but the silence never ended. Not in the halls, not in her heart. She told herself the Jedi must never fracture again. That unity was more important than mercy. That those who left the Order once should never be allowed to return, never. She said these things out loud, with confidence, but inside she was still listening, still hoping that maybe one voice would return from the void and say her name again. The war ended, but the silence didn't. Malachor V was supposed to be the final blow. Instead, it became something else. A scar, a shadow in the Force so deep, even the Masters feared to speak of it. Atris read every report. She pieced together battle logs, scattered testimonies, intercepted transmissions. But the truth never came whole. Only fragments. A weapon called the Mass Shadow Generator. A single activation. 1,000 ships crushed in seconds. And at the center, the Exile. She had stood on the bridge, watched the destruction unfold, and walked away, not as a victor, not as a hero, as something else, a wound. Atris studied the records until the texts blurred. She traced the name again and again, hoping it would change. But it didn't. The Exile had followed Revan, had disobeyed the Council, had vanished after Malachor. And now, she was being erased. The Order removed her name from the archives, stripped her of rank, spoke of her only behind closed doors. Atris said nothing, not because she agreed, but because she couldn't find the words. She wanted to forget. But forgetting is a lie. She remembered everything. The way the exile looked before leaving, the weight in her voice, the silence between them that said more than any argument could. They never said goodbye. And maybe that hurt the most. Atris never stopped searching. She monitored border activity, listened for whispers from the rim, reviewed any disturbance in the force that felt familiar. But the exile had disappeared. Some said she was dead. Others said she had severed herself from the force completely. Atris didn't know what to believe. Only what she felt, that something was missing, that something had broken, and that it had started with a name she no longer dared to speak. She tried to bury it. She doubled her efforts in the archives, tightened restrictions, closed off access to controversial records, Sith teachings, dark side rituals, theories about force wounds. She told herself it was for protection, but really, it was to keep the questions from spreading, especially the one that never left her. Why? Why had the exile left? Why had she followed Revan? Why had she stayed silent all these years? The council said it didn't matter, that the exile's fate was sealed. But to Atris, it mattered more than anything. Because if the exile was lost, what did that make Atris? The one who stayed, the one who judged, the one who said nothing when it counted. She stared at the sealed records, felt the cold in the room where no sunlight ever reached, and wondered if forgetting the past was worse than facing it. But she already knew the answer, and she already knew the price. Judgment came to the temple quietly, without ceremony or warning. It arrived as a request from the council, but felt like a sentence already decided. Atris stood among the masters, her hands folded, her expression calm. Inside, memory pressed against her chest, demanding to be heard at last. By force, the exile had returned, summoned back from nothingness to face the order she once served, not to be forgiven, but to be judged. Publicly, finally, Atris knew the charges: defiance, disobedience, silence after Malachor. Each word felt heavy, yet necessary to say. She kept her voice even, measured, controlled always. The council asked for clarity, for certainty, for finality. Atris gave them structure, not mercy. She spoke of the code as law, unchanging and clean. But as she spoke, she could not meet the exile's eyes. There was no defiance there, only acceptance and distance. That hurt more than anger. The sentence was severance, exile from the force, exile from the order. Atris delivered it without pause, without tremor, without breath. History recorded the moment. When it ended, the room felt emptier. The exile bowed once and turned away. Atris did not stop her. She could not. She would not. Afterward, Atris returned to the archives, hands shaking slightly for the first time. She told herself justice required distance, distance required silence. She obeyed both. But judgment did not end the memory. It sealed it inside her. The exile's absence became a presence, heavy and constant, unanswered forever inside Atris. She had spoken as the order's voice, but felt something break. Not in the force, but in herself. A fracture no record could contain, ever. Atris believed the judgment would bring closure. Instead, it followed her into every quiet hole. The silence after Malachor had found a new home. Within. She did not know it yet, but this moment would define her. The judge she became was born from loss, not wisdom. Control followed after. The exile walked away unchained, and Atris remained, bound to rules that could not comfort her. She watched the door close. Something closed with it. From that day, judgment never left her. It followed every decision, every rule, every quiet fear, and it would one day consume her entirely. Slowly, the council called it necessary, Atris called it order. Neither name eased the weight she carried. Memory pressed harder than any verdict ever could. Pronounced. She told herself the Force approved, that silence meant agreement. But the Force remained still. No comfort, no forgiveness, only echoes of Malachor, enduring endlessly. Night after night, Atris replayed the trial. Different words, different pauses, the same ending. She always spoke. The exile always left. Judgment always won there. She told herself this was strength, but strength without understanding becomes cruelty. She felt that truth but refused it. Refusal became habit. Habit became identity. The order survived. Atris survived. Yet something essential did not. It was left behind with the exile, unacknowledged, unmourned, unchanged. The loss became permanent then. From this judgment came distance. From distance came control. From control came fear. Atris felt the pattern forming. She ignored it deliberately. Consequences waited patiently. The exile's name was sealed away. Atris's heart was sealed with it. 2 closures, 2 silences. Neither was peace. Both were wounds without end, enduring. She believed judgment would protect the order. Instead, it isolated her. Atris stood closer to authority, farther from understanding. That distance grew with time. Unnoticed, the Force did not condemn her. It did not forgive her. It simply remembered, and memory was the burden Atris was least prepared to carry. This judgment would follow her to Telos, to ice, to secrets, to darkness. It began here, in silence, with a choice she never escaped. Afterward, Atris didn't fight in the war, but the war still changed her. She watched it unfold through records, through names, through silence. Revan became something else. Malak followed him, and the Jedi who returned weren't Jedi anymore. They had seen too much, done too much, buried too much. Atris documented every phase of the war. She catalogued betrayals, losses, disappearances. But it wasn't just the order that was unraveling. It was her. She told herself she was holding the line, keeping the past alive, protecting what was left. But what was left didn't look like the Jedi anymore. The archives were untouched, but the truth was changing. The Jedi Code no longer explained anything. Not Revan, not Malachor, not the Exile, especially not the Exile. Atris tried to forget the name, tried to bury the feelings, but they returned, always. Memories she didn't want, questions she couldn't silence. Why did she follow him? Why didn't she say goodbye? Atris tried to find comfort in duty, but duty without understanding turns cold. She gave more speeches now, tighter restrictions, sharper rules. She stopped listening, started commanding, and the other Jedi noticed. They didn't challenge her, but they pulled away. She became something distant, respected, feared, alone. When whispers reached the council that Revan had fallen, Atris didn't flinch. Not at the name, not at the betrayal. She expected it. But when Malak bombarded Telos, something in her broke. It wasn't just a world. It was a promise, a symbol, a future, gone in minutes. And with it, whatever softness she had left. She told herself the Sith were the enemy, but she was starting to see them everywhere. In Revan, in the exile, in the shadows of the order itself. She doubled her efforts, buried herself in texts, began to collect things she shouldn't. Sith teachings, holocrons long hidden, knowledge meant to stay sealed. She said it was for study, for defense, but it was more than that. She needed control, not over others, over the chaos, over the fear. She couldn't understand how everything had changed so quickly, how the Jedi had become ghosts in their own temple, how the war had passed through her without even touching her skin but still carved her open. This wasn't about politics or strategy. It was personal. Revan had taken the order. The exile had taken something more, something Atris never named, something she had never admitted. But it was gone now, and she couldn't bring it back. So she built walls, cold ones, quiet ones. She wrapped herself in white, in rules, in silence. No one noticed the shift, not at first. They still saw a Jedi, still saw the calm. But light, when held too tightly, begins to fracture, and Atris was cracking, slowly, painlessly, quiet enough to pass as strength. But it was already happening. She didn't fight in the war, but it left its mark just the same. Atris thought the silence would last forever. The war had passed. The order was broken, but still breathing. The exile was gone, and for a time that was enough. No letters, no sightings, no apology. The name was sealed away like a bad memory, buried in the cold. But memory has weight, and silence never lasts. The past walked through the temple gates without warning. No guards, no entourage, no sound but footsteps. Atris felt it before she saw it. A shift, a disturbance, like a wound reopening in the Force. She turned and saw her, the same face, but different, older, yet empty in a way Atris didn't understand. The exile had returned, not to reclaim anything, not to fight, just to stand before the council and be judged. Atris didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. She watched the exile walk into the chamber, watched her stand where traitors had stood, where Sith had been named. The same girl who once smiled beside her during meditations now stood in silence beneath the full weight of the order. No anger, no defense, just waiting. Atris told herself this was justice, that the exile deserved this. She had walked away from the Jedi, walked away from Atris, and now she wanted to return, as if time hadn't passed, as if Malashore had never happened. Atris stepped forward, not as a friend, not even as a Jedi, as something else, a judge, a wall, a voice that would not tremble. She asked the questions, recited the charges, quoted the code like scripture. The exile did not argue, did not protest. She answered with calm, with truth. She admitted to the choice, to the war, to the consequences, but she did not beg. Atris hated that, not because it was wrong, but because it was honest, too honest. Because if the exile could own her guilt, then what was Atris still hiding? The chamber was cold, the council quiet, but inside Atris something raged. She wanted to speak as a Jedi, but she was speaking as something else. Someone who had waited too long for closure. Someone who had buried too much under robes and law. The exile stood there, unchanged by judgment, while Atris was unraveling behind the mask. And still she spoke. Words of duty, words of purity, but they weren't about justice. They were about control. Control over the silence, over the pain, over the version of the past she needed to believe. The trial ended. The verdict was given. The exile would be cast out again. Official now. Final. But Atris didn't feel victory. She felt cold. As the exile turned to leave, their eyes met for the first time. Not as Jedi, not as rivals, as two people who once shared something, now buried beneath years of silence. Atris didn't speak, couldn't, and the exile didn't wait. She just walked away. The trial was already decided. It had been decided long before the exile returned, long before the council gathered, long before Atris spoke. Justice was only the shape it took. The chamber felt smaller than Atris remembered, the air heavier, the silence sharper. She stood where she always stood, straight, certain. The masters asked their questions, formal, careful. Atris answered before anyone else could. She always did. She spoke of Malachor, of disobedience, of the cost of defying the council. Her voice did not rise. It did not shake. It cut. She framed the war as failure, the choice as weakness, the silence afterward as proof of guilt. Each word placed like stone. The exile listened. No interruption, no denial. That unsettled Atris more than resistance ever could. The council turned to the exile for explanation, for justification, for regret. What they received was truth. Simple, unearned. The exile spoke of duty to the Republic, of lives that would have been lost, of a choice made when waiting was no longer possible. No excuses, no praise, only acceptance. Atris felt the balance shift. This was not how trials were meant to go. She stepped in again, redirected the focus, brought the code back into the room like a weapon. Intent mattered less than obedience, outcome less than order. She reminded the council that Jedi do not choose their own wars, that the Force is not bent by fear. She did not say the exile's name. She did not have to. The weight of it filled the chamber anyway. The masters whispered among themselves. Conflicted, tired, Atris pushed harder. If this was forgiven, she argued, then nothing mattered. If this was excused, the order would fracture again. She spoke of Revan, of Malak, of how easily conviction becomes corruption. Her words were true, but incomplete. She did not speak of love, of loyalty, of what it meant to watch someone leave and never return. Those truths stayed buried. The council reached their decision. Severance. The exile would be stripped of the Force, cut loose from the order, left to walk the galaxy alone. Atris nodded, not in relief, in confirmation. The sentence was carried out. No ceremony, no comfort. The Force fell silent around the exile like a door closing. Atris felt it, a sudden absence, a void where something living had been. For a moment, she faltered. Just a moment. Then she straightened. This was justice, she told herself. Necessary, clean. But as the exile turned away, Atris felt the truth settle. This trial was never about balance. It was about fear. Fear of what the war had revealed. Fear of what choice had done to the Jedi. Fear of facing her own part in the silence. Atris had hidden judgment behind law, pain behind duty, and the order had let her. The chamber emptied. The verdict remained, and Atris stood alone with it. Atris didn't speak of it afterward. Not to the council, not to the archives. not even to herself. The exile was gone again, judged, banished, erased, and still she lingered, not in voice, not in presence, but in memory. Atris felt it in the quiet between meetings, in the moments when the chambers emptied, when no one was watching. She would stop walking, turn back, half expecting to see her, but the hole was always empty. The verdict had been final, but her mind wasn't finished. She tried to return to her duties, tried to find refuge in structure, in silence. But the trial had left something behind. Not peace, not certainty. A weight, and it followed her. She reviewed holocron entries late into the night, spoke less in council debates, sharpened her tone when questioned. The others called it focus. It wasn't. She was guarding something, something she didn't want uncovered, something she didn't want to name. Guilt. It lived beneath the surface, beneath the white robes, beneath the voice that always sounded so sure. She told herself she had done what was necessary, that the exile had broken the code, that the judgment was fair. But fairness is not the same as truth, and truth had not been part of the sentence. She hadn't spoken of the bond they shared, the hours in the archives, the rare smiles, the way her voice softened when only they were in the room. Atris had buried all of that, because to speak it was to admit it mattered, and nothing was allowed to matter more than the order. She told herself the exile had made the choice, had walked away, but so had she. She could have stopped the trial, could have defended her, could have said her name. She didn't, because it was easier to be right than to be honest. The white robes made it simple. They gave her purpose, clarity, and they hid everything she didn't want to feel. But guilt doesn't vanish. It lingers, sleeps, waits. She began to dream of the trial, again and again, but it was different each time. In one dream, she stood silent as the exile was judged. In another, she tried to speak, but no sound came. And in the worst ones, she saw herself in the exile's place, surrounded, alone, abandoned. She would wake in the dark, breathing shallow, whispers echoing in her mind. Not from the Force, from memory. Guilt doesn't speak loudly. It whispers. She tried to smother it with more discipline, more rules, more isolation. But the more she pressed down, the more it pressed back. The exile had been cast out, but Atris had remained. And in staying, she had become something else. A keeper of order, but not of peace. A voice of judgment, but not of understanding. She still wore the white robes, still spoke for the council, still walked the ancient halls. But a part of her had never left that chamber. It was still standing beside the exile, still waiting to speak, still afraid of what it might say. Atris believed in order. She believed it saved the Jedi, preserved the past, protected the future. But belief is not always truth, and control is not always wisdom. After the trial, something shifted. She began to speak differently, more certain, more severe. The other masters noticed. They said nothing. They thought it was strength. They didn't see the cracks beneath it. Atris tightened her grip on the archives, redefined access, redacted entries, silenced contradictions. She called it necessary. Too much freedom had led to war. Too many choices had led to Malachor. Now, only control could save what was left. She became the guardian of purity. At least, that's what she told herself. Behind the locked doors, Atris studied holocrons the council had sealed away. Dark teachings, forbidden knowledge. She didn't seek power. She told herself that every day she sought understanding, so the mistakes of the past would never repeat. But the line between understanding and obsession is thin, and Atris was already crossing it. She spoke often of Jedi principles, of discipline, of silence, but she no longer lived them. Her thoughts were louder than ever, her judgments sharper, her presence colder. She began to see danger where there was none, dissent in every question, weakness in every hesitation. She no longer listened. She only corrected. Her certainty became armor, heavy, unquestioned, and beneath that armor, her fear grew. Fear that the exile had been right. Fear that the council had been wrong. Fear that if she stopped holding everything together, it would all fall apart again. So she gripped harder. She revised the archives to reflect her truth, buried alternate accounts, eliminated inconsistencies. Truth became a weapon, shaped by her hands, bent to her will, and still, she told herself this was loyalty. Loyalty to the code, to the order, to the Jedi. But deep down, she wasn't sure anymore. Because the exile had walked away and returned stronger, not darker, not lost, just whole. Atris couldn't understand it, couldn't allow it. So she erased it, not from history, from herself. She silenced the part of her that still remembered laughter, the long nights in the archives, the voice that made her feel something other than duty. She buried it beneath doctrine, buried it beneath robes, buried it beneath control. But some truths don't stay buried. And the more she tried to control the past, the more it controlled her. She didn't notice it at first. The way her voice lost warmth, the way her decisions grew harsher, the way others began to speak in whispers when she passed. Control had become her identity, and now it was becoming her prison. She thought she was protecting the order, but what she was really protecting was herself, from regret, from memory, from everything she could no longer face. Control is not the same as truth, and the more she clung to it, the farther she drifted from both. The room was never meant to be found. It existed outside the archives, outside the temple's memory, outside permission. Atris built it in silence, not in defiance, not in secrecy, in certainty. She told herself it was precaution, a safeguard against ignorance, a place to contain what the Jedi feared to face. The door responded only to her. No guards, no markings, no records, just cold stone and intention. Inside, the light was different, dim, controlled, unforgiving. The holocrons waited, ancient, cracked, still alive with echoes. Sith holocrons, confiscated across centuries, sealed by the Order, declared too dangerous to study. Atris had moved them here one by one. Carefully, methodically, she told the council they were secured. She did not tell them where. She stood among them now, hands folded, breath steady. She did not touch them. Not yet. She believed proximity was enough. That observation was not corruption. That knowledge could be contained if the mind was disciplined. She had spent her life believing this. The holocrons pulsed faintly, not calling, waiting. Atris ignored the sensation. She reminded herself of the code, of restraint, of the dangers of curiosity. She was not like Revan. She was not like the Exile. She did not seek answers through action. She sought them through control. This room was proof, a place where darkness could be studied without being embraced, where Sith lies could be catalogued and neutralized, where history could be mastered. She walked slowly between the pedestals. Some holocrons were broken, others scarred by Force lightning, all of them dangerous. She knew their names: Darth Nihilus, Darth Sion, Darth Treya, whispers of hunger, of pain, of betrayal. She did not activate them. She didn't need to. Just knowing they were there gave her comfort. Because as long as darkness was contained, it could not surprise the Order again. That was her logic. But logic does not quiet the Force. The room felt heavy, like it was listening back. Atris felt it in her chest, a pressure she dismissed as tension. She told herself this was responsibility, that only someone with discipline like hers could bear it. Others would be tempted. Others would fall. She would not. She had judged the Exile, condemned Revan, watched the Order burn from hesitation. She would not hesitate again. If darkness threatened the Jedi, she would know it first. She would understand it before it struck, and she would stop it. That was the lie she hadn't recognized yet. Atris believed the danger was in the knowledge itself. She was wrong. The danger was in believing she was immune. She stood alone in the room, surrounded by Sith memory. White robes against ancient shadow, and for the first time, the silence felt different, not empty, attentive. The holocrons did not speak. They did not need to. They had already been heard. Atris told herself she would only observe. Nothing more. Study did not mean surrender. Listening did not mean believing. That was the difference between a Jedi and a Sith, or so she believed. She returned to the hidden room night after night, always alone, always composed. She would stand before the holocrons in silence, not activating them, not touching them, just watching, feeling. The Force moved strangely there, not violent, not loud, patient. Atris focused on breathing, on discipline, on the code. There is no emotion. There is peace. She repeated it until the words felt thin. The holocrons pulsed faintly, like distant hearts, like memories waiting to be acknowledged. Atris began to justify her presence. If the Sith had nearly destroyed the Order, then ignorance was the real enemy. The Jedi had failed because they did not understand their opposite. Revan had understood. That was the truth she avoided. He had studied both sides, balanced them, and still fell. Atris told herself she would do better. She began with fragments, archived transcriptions, second-hand accounts. She read about hunger, about pain, about betrayal turned into strength. The Sith did not deny emotion. They refined it. That thought lingered longer than it should have. Atris dismissed it. Emotion led to chaos. Chaos led to Malachor. She knew this, but the Sith saw emotion as fuel, as clarity that frightened her and fascinated her. She activated a holocron for the first time. Just one. The room grew colder. A voice emerged. Low, measured. It did not command. It explained. It spoke of power not as domination, but as understanding oneself completely. Atris listened without reacting. She told herself this was analysis, nothing more. But the voice was calm, reasonable. It did not sound like madness. It sounded like certainty. Atris shut the holocron down quickly. Her heart was racing. She told herself it was instinct. A warning. She was still in control. But control felt different now. More fragile. She returned again. This time, she activated another. Different voice. Same tone. Each holocron spoke of the Jedi as incomplete. Afraid of truth, fearful of loss. They spoke of restraint as weakness. Atris felt anger rise. The Jedi were not weak. They were disciplined. They endured. But the words lingered. Because somewhere inside her, she agreed. The Order had hesitated, delayed, judged too late. The Sith did not hesitate. They acted. Atris closed the holocrons and left the room. She walked the long corridors back to her chambers. Her steps echoed differently now. She told herself she was learning the enemy, preparing defenses. But the Sith were not shouting at her. They were whispering. They did not demand allegiance. They offered explanation. And explanation is dangerous, because it feels like truth. Atris stood before the mirror in her chamber. White robes, calm face. She looked unchanged. But something inside her had shifted. She told herself she was still a Jedi. Still pure, still untouched. But learning from the enemy requires listening. And listening is the first step toward believing. The room grew colder, not with temperature, with intention. Atris felt it the moment she entered. The holocrons were no longer silent. They waited, not like objects, like minds. She told herself the change was imagined, a side effect of exhaustion. But the force felt different here now. Denser, focused. She stood still and listened. Not with her ears, with memory. The Sith did not shout. They never had. They whispered. They spoke of failure, of how the Jedi lost because they feared choice, because they clung to balance instead of will. Atris felt the words settle. She remembered Malachor, the silence after the weapon fired, the emptiness the exile carried. The Sith called it clarity. They said pain strips illusion. That loss reveals truth. Atris told herself these were lies. But lies are easy to reject. These were not easy. They spoke of control, not over others, over oneself. They spoke of discipline sharpened by emotion, not drowned by it. Atris had always believed emotion was the weakness. Yet here she stood, calm, ordered, and still, fractured. She activated another holocron. The voice was softer, older. It spoke of betrayal, of apprentices surpassing masters, of knowledge hoarded and punished. Atris felt anger rise. The Jedi did not punish knowledge. They protected it, didn't they? She thought of the sealed archives, the redacted texts, the voices she had silenced. The thought passed quickly. She focused on the words. The Sith spoke of the Force as a mirror, that it reflects what is held inside. If that was true, what was it reflecting in her? She felt a pressure behind her eyes, a tightening in her chest. She shut the holocron down. The room fell quiet again, but the quiet was no longer empty. It was listening. Atris stepped back. She told herself this was enough, that she had learned what she needed. But she did not leave. She stood there, surrounded by frozen echoes. The ice beneath the academy held ancient scars. Telos had been scarred by Malak's bombardment, by Revan's war, scars hidden beneath reconstruction. Just like her, the Sith voices spoke of rebuilding through truth, not denial. Atris clenched her hands. She had denied nothing. She had endured. But endurance without release becomes rot. She felt the realization press in. The Jedi had failed to adapt, failed to confront what the war had revealed. And she had helped enforce that silence. The whispers did not accuse her. They understood her. That frightened her more than judgment ever had. She took a slow breath, centered herself. She was still Atris, still a Jedi. She would not fall. She would use this knowledge, shape it, contain it. The holocrons pulsed softly, almost approving. Atris turned away at last. As she reached the door, she paused, for just a moment. And in that moment, she realized something had changed. The whispers were no longer beneath the ice. They were inside her now. Atris told herself she could stop any time. That was the first lie. She wasn't addicted to the knowledge. She wasn't falling. She was in control. That was the second. She told herself she was still protecting the Jedi, still serving the Order. But she no longer served anyone, only a silence that grew darker by the day. She returned to the hidden room more often, but not to study, to feel. The holocrons gave her something the Council never had. Answers, not peace, not truth, but clarity, the kind that burns, the kind that numbs everything else. She began to repeat their words in private, not aloud, but in thought. Discipline without power is surrender. Emotion denied becomes weakness. To control the Force, you must first understand what lies beneath it. She told herself it was strategy, that her mind remained her own. But the voice she used to reassure herself was no longer hers. She started speaking differently in council sessions. Stricter, sharper. She interrupted more often, dismissed suggestions with cold finality. Other masters exchanged glances. They said nothing. She was still Atris, still robed in white, still untouched. But the whiteness no longer meant purity. It meant distance, the kind that cannot be crossed. She began sealing off portions of the archive. Not just Sith knowledge, Jedi history too. Any records that questioned the code. Any teachings that conflicted with her vision. Truth became a puzzle she rearranged to fit her silence. It was subtle, slow, like frost spreading across a mirror. And she told herself the same lie, that this was still her choice, that she had not been changed. She still stood for the Jedi, but only as she defined them. And every day, that definition narrowed. She told herself she hadn't crossed the line, but she no longer looked behind her to see where it was. The exile returned once more, different, whole in ways Atris didn't understand. It shook her. The one she had cast out had come back stronger, not because she had followed the code, because she had broken it. Atris felt rage, not the loud kind, the quiet kind that seeps through cracks, the kind that builds behind walls of certainty. She confronted the exile, spoke with the voice of the Order, but her voice trembled, because she saw something in the exile's eyes, something she had lost. Clarity, peace, forgiveness. Atris hadn't felt forgiveness in years, not from others, not from herself. And in that moment, she realized the first lie had never left her. She couldn't stop, not because she wouldn't, because she didn't know how. She had built her identity around the illusion of control, and now she was trapped inside it. The holocrons remained locked away, but they no longer needed to be opened. Their whispers had become her thoughts, Their teachings had shaped her doubts, her fears, her silence. She still wore the robes, still spoke the words, but the light she once served no longer recognized her. Tellers was quiet, too quiet. The ice beneath the academy never shifted, never cracked, never forgave. Atris chose this place for a reason. Distance from the council, from the temple, from memory. She told herself the cold would bring clarity, that isolation would sharpen her resolve. But cold does not clarify, it preserves. The academy stood rebuilt over scars no one wanted to remember. Malak's bombardment had frozen Telos in history. Reconstruction hid the wounds. Atris felt at home. She walked the long corridors alone. Her footsteps echoed softly, controlled, measured. The force felt thin here, muted. She liked that. It didn't challenge her, didn't question her thoughts, didn't whisper back. The ice outside pressed against the walls like a warning. Atris ignored it. She told herself she was still the same, still disciplined, still untouched. But the cold was already inside her. She spent hours in meditation chambers that never warmed, her breath visible in the air, her thoughts sharper than ever. She replayed the past, the trial, the exile's eyes, the silence afterward. Each memory felt distant, preserved, encased, just like Telos. She told herself this was healing. It wasn't. The academy began to change around her. Or maybe she changed first. The halls felt narrower, the lights dimmer. Her voice echoed longer when she spoke, colder. She noticed it. She didn't stop it. The students stationed here avoided her. They bowed. They obeyed. But they did not approach. Atris preferred it that way. Attachment led to weakness. She had learned that lesson well. She sealed off sections of the academy, restricted access, expanded her private chambers, and beneath the ice, she hid the holocrons. She told herself they were safer here, far from the temple, far from temptation. But temptation does not need warmth. It thrives in stillness. The holocrons remained silent. For now, Atris did not activate them. She simply knew they were close. That knowledge comforted her. She began to speak less, to command more. Her gaze hardened. Her patience thinned. She no longer asked questions. She issued corrections. The Jedi Code felt distant here, like a memory spoken in another life. She told herself the Force was quieter because she was stronger. But quiet does not always mean peace. Sometimes it means withdrawal. She stood at the academy's edge one night, staring across the endless ice fields. The wind howled softly, relentlessly. She felt nothing. No awe, no fear, just cold. And for the first time, that frightened her. She had once believed light was warmth, that compassion was strength. Now those ideas felt fragile, naive. The galaxy had proven otherwise. War had proven otherwise. The exile had proven otherwise. Atris turned away from the ice, back toward the academy, back toward control. She did not see the frost creeping along the walls, did not hear the subtle hum beneath the floor. The Force was not silent here. It was waiting, and the cold that never melts was no longer outside her. Her voice changed before she noticed, not in volume, in weight. It carried farther now, cut cleaner. Students listened more closely and spoke less. Atris did not raise her tone. She never needed to. Authority followed her words like frost. She addressed the academy from the central hall. Not often, only when necessary. Necessity, she decided, was frequent. She spoke of order, of vigilance, of the failures that had nearly destroyed the Jedi. She never spoke of fear, but it shaped every sentence. The Force felt distant here, as if wrapped in layers of ice. Atris told herself this was discipline at work. That clarity came when emotion fell silent. Yet when she meditated, the quiet felt hollow, empty of guidance, empty of warmth. She filled it with her own certainty. Decisions came faster now, cleaner, final. She reassigned duties without consultation, rewrote protocols, closed chambers deemed unnecessary. No one argued. They obeyed. That obedience reassured her. It meant she was right, but something else followed her voice now. A tension, a pressure. When she spoke, the room tightened, as if the walls leaned in to listen. Atris noticed the way others avoided her gaze, how they answered quickly, how they stepped aside without being asked. Respect, she told herself, not fear. She repeated that lie often. In private, she returned to the sealed chambers, to the place beneath the academy. She did not open the holocrons. She did not need to. Their presence felt closer, like breath against skin. She would stand there and speak aloud, testing her voice. It sounded different here, lower, sharper. She liked that. It felt honest. She began to rehearse arguments she would never make publicly, judgments she would never announce. Words about weakness, about failure, about how the Jedi had earned their suffering. She stopped herself when she realized what she was saying, but she did not leave. The ice above groaned softly as Telos shifted, a distant sound, constant. Atris felt it resonate inside her chest. She told herself the cold was a teacher, that it stripped away excess. Yet she could no longer remember warmth clearly. The temple on Coruscant felt like a dream now, the archives like a story she had once read. Here, everything was simple. Rules, silence, control. Her voice reflected that simplicity. When students asked questions, she answered briefly. When they hesitated, she corrected them. Emotion was inefficiency. She removed it. One night, she heard herself speak the code, out loud, alone. The words sounded unfamiliar, as if spoken by someone else. She stopped midway, listened. The silence answered back. It did not judge her, did not guide her. It accepted her. That acceptance felt comforting and dangerous. Atris straightened her robes, white against stone. She told herself nothing had changed, that this was leadership, necessary, earned, but leadership should not feel this cold. And voices shaped by truth do not lose warmth. Atris had not noticed when it happened, only that when she spoke now, the Force did not echo. It withdrew, and something else listened instead. Atris no longer knew where she stood. Not fully. She wore the robes, spoke the words, issued commands, but the Force did not respond as it once had. Not warmly, not clearly. She felt it at the edges now, distant, watching. The Jedi would have called it imbalance. The Sith would have called it awakening. Atris rejected both. She was neither. She told herself that often. She was beyond such labels, beyond failure, beyond temptation. The academy reflected her certainty. Students trained in silence. Meditation halls emptied faster than before. Questions stopped coming, not because answers were found, but because asking felt dangerous. Atris believed this was progress. Order had been restored, yet something unsettled her. The Force moved strangely around her, not resisting, not embracing, avoiding. She felt it when she reached outward, a hesitation, a pause where guidance should have been. She told herself the Force respected her restraint, but respect does not feel like absence. She began to rely on memory instead, on precedent, on rules she could enforce without the Force's help, power without connection. It worked. At first, her authority was unquestioned, her decisions absolute. But alone in her chambers, doubts crept in. Not loud doubts, quiet ones. Was she still a Jedi? If the Force no longer answered, she dismissed the thought. The Force was not something to be relied upon blindly. The Jedi had proven that, and the Sith had proven something worse. She walked the thin space between them, a place she believed only she could stand. Neither Jedi nor Sith, just Atris, just control. She returned to the hidden chambers beneath the academy. Not often, but regularly. She stood before the holocrons without activating them. She no longer needed their voices. She had memorized their lessons. Emotion acknowledged, not indulged. Power understood, not feared. Truth shaped, not questioned. She told herself this was mastery. But mastery should not feel so lonely. The cold beneath Telos pressed in, relentless, unchanging. Atris felt it settle deeper within her. She remembered the exile. Not with anger now, with confusion. The exile had walked away from the Force and returned whole. Atris had clung to the Order and felt hollow. The thought lingered longer than it should have. She pushed it aside. Comparison was weakness. She was not lost. She was refining herself. Yet when she reached for the Force again, there was only distance. No rejection, no embrace, just separation. She felt a flicker of fear, quickly buried. Fear was for those without discipline. She tightened her control, doubled her resolve. If the Force would not guide her, she would guide herself. That was the moment she crossed the line, not into darkness, but away from balance. Neither Jedi nor Sith. Something colder, something alone. She stood in the center of the academy, listening to the ice shift and groan. The sound felt familiar now, comforting. She did not notice the way the Force pulled back, or how easily she let it go. The transformation wasn't sudden. It never is. Darkness doesn't roar. It whispers, and then it waits. Atris still looked like a Jedi, still walked with grace, still spoke with clarity. But something beneath her skin had changed. Something cold. She noticed it in small ways. She no longer felt the seasons, no longer reacted to warmth. The sun on Telos meant nothing now. It touched her face, but not her. She avoided mirrors, not out of shame, out of disinterest. She no longer searched her own eyes for reflection. She already knew what stared back: discipline, purpose, distance. The things she had chosen, the things that had become her. She didn't call it the dark side. She didn't call it anything. It was just silence that obeyed her, stillness that never broke, and that stillness obeyed no one else. She dismissed several students that season, reassigned, removed. No anger, no trial, just quiet decisions made from colder logic. They were weak, she told herself, too emotional, too unsure. The Order could not afford that again. Not after Revan. Not after the exile. She had become the correction, the counterweight, and that meant she couldn't waver. She began spending more time in isolation, with the holocrons, with the darkened halls beneath the academy. She no longer listened for their voices. They no longer needed to speak. The knowledge had become instinct. The warnings had become strategies. She adjusted her tone, her posture, even the way she breathed when she entered a room. Every word was measured, every silence intentional. She watched others with colder eyes. Not hostile, not cruel, just distant. She believed this was strength. But strength without feeling becomes stone, and stone cannot bend. She felt herself harden in ways she couldn't reverse. Kindness became hesitation. Empathy became error. Even memory began to fade. She tried to recall the sound of the exile's voice, not the last time, but the first. The way she laughed, the way she questioned everything, the way she made Atris feel uncertain. She couldn't remember the details anymore, just the ache that followed. The ache was easier to hold on to. It gave her direction. The exile had walked into exile willingly. Atris had stayed. And somehow, Atris was the one who had vanished, not in body, in spirit. She stood in the center of her academy now, still, unmoving, white robes, pale light, walls of silence, and inside her, ice, the kind that doesn't melt, the kind that spreads. It had started beneath Telos, buried in the forgotten chambers, whispered through ancient knowledge, but now it lived in her voice, in her steps, in her certainty. The transformation was complete. She was not a Sith. She was not a Jedi. She was something colder, something alone. She stepped onto the snow without a word. The wind did not welcome her. It screamed, not at her, but around her, as if the frozen world itself remembered what she'd done. She wore no Jedi robes, no badge of rank, no symbol of allegiance, only silence and guilt. Atris watched from the shadows. Her heart did not race. It locked, harder than stone, because the woman approaching was not a student. She was a mirror, and Atris could not bear her own reflection. The other handmaidens stood still. Even they could feel it now. The disturbance in the force, the pressure in the air, the crack in something sacred. It wasn't the dark side. Not yet. But it was something just as dangerous. Memory. Because the woman walking toward the Telos Academy had once been her friend, her student, her defender, her failure, the exile. She had come back, not to atone, not to argue, but to understand. She had questions, and Atris had buried the answers. Long ago, the doors opened, and the snow spilled in behind her. Her boots left wet marks on the polished floor, each step louder than the last. Not because of sound, but because of what it meant. She was home, and nothing felt safe. Atris did not speak. She stood tall, draped in white, immovable, untouched. But inside, her thoughts screamed louder than the wind outside. Why now? Why return? Why look at me like that? The exile said nothing, but her presence was an accusation, not of war, but of abandonment. Atris could feel the old wounds open again, not the ones from battle, but the ones from betrayal and guilt. Because when the Jedi Council cast the exile out, Atris had stood among them, not in protest, not in mourning, but in silence. That silence returned now, thick as the ice above the academy. Neither woman blinked, neither moved. It was not a reunion. It was a confrontation, but without sabers, without shouts, just two souls in a hallway of secrets. One returned from war, the other buried beneath robes of righteousness. The exile finally spoke. Her voice had changed. Lower, calmer, but not cold. Never cold. Unlike Atris, she asked what had become of the Order. She asked why nothing had changed. She asked why the Force still felt broken. Atris gave no answers, only lectures. Sharp, calculated phrases. Duty, discipline, detachment. But the words rang hollow, because the woman before her had felt the Force die. She had carried its corpse across battlefields. She had wept for the Jedi when no one else did. And now, she was being judged by someone who had stayed behind, someone who had watched the galaxy burn through a telescope and called it balance. The pain was too old to cry over, too deep to ignore. So they stood there, one trying to understand, the other trying to forget. But the Force remembered everything. The Academy's lights flickered. The wind pressed against the walls. The Force shifted, because history had returned, and neither of them knew what to do with it. She had come as a shadow, but not to haunt, to ask, to look, to remember. And Telos was not ready. Atris was not ready. Because when you bury the past in snow, it always melts. And when it melts, it drowns you. The exile stood still, not as a threat, but as a reminder that the war wasn't over, that the silence was never peace, and that nothing had ever been resolved. Atris turned her gaze away. For the first time in years, she felt afraid, not of the woman, but of the truth she carried, and the truths Atris had locked away, far beneath the ice. Atris faced her at last, not with anger, with precision. She measured the exile the way she measured everything now. Posture, breath, silence. The woman before her was not broken. That was the problem. She stood calm, whole, unbowed, as if Malachor had not shattered the Force around her, as if exile had not hollowed her life, as if judgment had not erased her name. Atris felt something twist. Envy. She refused to name it. The exile looked back without accusation, without apology, just awareness. That look pierced deeper than any blade, because it reflected Atris exactly as she was. Cold, guarded, afraid. Atris spoke first. She spoke of rules, of consequences, of duty. Her voice was steady, unforgiving. She reminded the exile of choices made, lines crossed, orders ignored. The exile listened, and then she asked a single question. Why? Not why she was judged, not why she was cast out. Why Atris had stayed silent. The words landed softly and cut deeply. Atris answered quickly. The code demanded it. The order required it. The Force agreed, but the exile did not argue. She only watched, as if listening for something Atris could not hear. Atris felt the mirror sharpen. The exile spoke of Malachor, not the battle, the aftermath, the emptiness, the wound. She spoke of choosing lives over doctrine, action over hesitation. She spoke of loss, not with pride, with sorrow. Atris tried to interrupt, tried to reclaim control. But the words kept coming, quiet, measured. The exile did not defend herself. She explained herself. And that was worse, because explanations invite understanding, and Atris could not afford that. She raised her voice slightly, only slightly. She accused the exile of arrogance, of believing she knew better than the council. The exile did not deny it. She accepted it. She said she would make the same choice again, to save lives, to act, to bear the cost alone. Atris felt the room tilt. The force shifted, not violently. Judging, Atris sensed something she had not felt in years. Doubt. She crushed it immediately. Doubt was weakness. She reminded the exile that strength without restraint destroys everything. That Revan had proven this. That Malak had proven this. The exile nodded. She did not disagree. She said only this: that restraint without compassion destroys just as much. The silence afterward was heavy. Atris felt the mirror crack. Because compassion was the word she avoided most. She stepped closer. Too close. Her voice hardened. She told the exile she had no right to question the order. That exile meant silence. That returning meant submission. The exile met her gaze. Steady. Unmoving. She said she did not return for permission. She returned because the force was broken, and Atris was standing at the center of the fracture. That was when anger finally surfaced. Not loud. Controlled. Atris dismissed the conversation, declared it finished. But mirrors do not shatter when dismissed. They linger, reflecting. Atris turned away first. She could not look any longer. Because the woman before her was not a failure. She was proof. Proof that Atris had chosen control over truth, silence over understanding, and white robes over mercy. The mirror had shown her everything, and it showed no mercy at all. Atris never spoke of what she felt that day. Not to the council, not to herself. She buried it in silence. And silence can rot into something else. The exile left the chamber without a word. Not victorious, not defeated, just unchanged. That was what shattered Atris most, that she could not break her. Not with judgment, not with law, not with shame. Atris told herself it was betrayal, that the woman she once trusted had left the Jedi, had left her. But deep beneath that anger was grief, not for the war, not even for the order, but for the bond that had once felt unbreakable. It was easier to burn that feeling than name it. So, Atris did. She turned guilt into blame, memory into resentment. Every time she saw the exile's face, she saw her own failure, the choice she hadn't made, the stance she hadn't taken, the love she had buried under duty. She told the other masters the exile was dangerous, that she was a shadow from Malachor, a wound walking. Some listened, most didn't. But Atris knew how to wait, how to collect silence like weapons. She spent her days in cold archives, rewriting records, reshaping stories. Not lies, just cleaner truths. She erased the moments that made her look unsure, uncertain, human, and in their place, she left pages of righteousness. History forged through control. It comforted her, for a time, but the Force does not forget, and memory has a gravity of its own. Every night she heard the exile's voice, not as an enemy, as a presence, soft, patient, asking questions Atris refused to answer. She meditated deeper, longer, trying to drown it. But the deeper she went, the colder it became. And the colder she became. Blame had turned into structure. structure into isolation, and isolation into something darker. She studied Sith teachings not openly, not with reverence, but with purpose. Understanding the enemy, she said, so that she could defeat it. But knowledge is never still. It seeps, it whispers, and the voice Atris heard in meditation was no longer the exile's. It was hers, sharper, stronger, colder. She called it clarity, but it was just hatred dressed in logic. The next time someone spoke the exile's name, Atris flinched, and then she smiled. A small one. She had given that name up long ago. It no longer carried weight. She would never say it again. She wouldn't need to. The exile had been judged, cast out, forgotten. At least, that's what she told herself. But the Force still carried her memory. Like a fault line under snow, waiting to break. It did not end with a duel. There was no blade drawn, no death, no triumph, no last breath spoken in rage. It ended with silence, the kind that wraps around you like a cold wind, the kind that never leaves. Atris stood in the middle of her sanctum. Holocrons glowed around her. Their red light danced across her face. She no longer flinched at their voices. They had become familiar, not welcomed, not feared, just present. She told herself she was strong enough to resist, that knowing darkness was not the same as joining it. But the room had no windows, and truth could not find her there. She sat alone, listening to Sith ghosts. Each whisper feeding the fire she would not admit was there. Even the council had grown distant. They could feel the shift, but they didn't act. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they hoped she'd return to the light. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. Because returning meant admitting what she had done, and what she had become. The exile left Telos without looking back. Not because she didn't care, but because she knew what silence meant. She had worn it before, carried it like armor. Now it belonged to Atris. Atris watched her go from the shadows. Eyes empty, breath slow. She felt nothing. At least, that's what she told herself. But hatred leaves echoes. And love, once broken, never fades cleanly. Every step the exile took away from Telos was a step Atris would never take. The academy remained quiet after that. No students, no lessons, just the sound of power humming behind stone walls. And a woman who had once believed in light, now wrapped in ice. Not Sith, not Jedi, just silence. When the war ended, no one came for her. No one remembered. She had vanished in the very place she tried to control. Time passed. Holocron dimmed, and the Force grew still around her. But inside, it was never quiet. The voice of the exile remained, not in anger, not in sorrow, but in memory. And memories don't die. They wait in the silence, until someone dares to listen again. She still wore white robes, still walked with her hands folded behind her back, still spoke with the cold precision of a Jedi historian. But Atris was no longer a Jedi. Not really. Not in the way the Order had meant. Not in the way she once believed. Because purity, for Atris, had become something else. It was no longer about balance. It was about control. She stood above others, convinced she alone could cleanse what remained of the Jedi. And when she looked at the galaxy, she didn't see survivors. She saw weakness, disgrace, and something in her broke. Not loudly, quietly, like frost creeping over glass. She began to isolate herself. not just physically but mentally. Her thoughts sharpened, her words grew colder, her tolerance thinned. She no longer argued with her peers. She dismissed them. They were too lenient, too forgiving, too slow to act. She believed they had failed the Republic. And so, she began rewriting the rules, one decision at a time, one justification after another. She called it preservation, but in truth, it was domination. She demanded loyalty from those beneath her, silence from those who questioned her, and total obedience from those who remained. She no longer taught Jedi ideals. She issued commands. Her archives became restricted. Access required permission, and permission required trust. But trust to Atris meant submission. If you disagreed, you were excluded. If you challenged, you were punished. And if you refused, you disappeared. She said it was necessary. That darkness had to be rooted out wherever it hid, even if it hid inside allies, even if it didn't exist at all. Her fear disguised itself as duty, her anger as righteousness, and her decisions, once made with the council, were now made in private, always justified, always cloaked in principle, but always hers. No one saw the holocrons at first. No one asked why she needed them. She claimed it was for research, for defense, to better understand the Sith and protect against them. But it wasn't protection she sought. It was power. She listened to them at night. Their whispers filled the silence, and in time, she stopped resisting. Not all at once, not with ceremony, just slowly, like forgetting a song you once loved. She still wore white robes, still sat in meditation halls lit with clean blue light, still recited the code as if it were sacred. But her eyes had changed. They no longer searched for light. They searched for control. And that made her dangerous, because when a Jedi believes she is always right, she stops seeing where she's gone wrong. Her actions escalated. She began arresting former allies, calling them traitors, calling them corrupted. No trials, no second chances, just decisions, swift and final, and always in the name of order. She told herself it was justice, that the Jedi had become soft, that the war had proven it, and that she would never allow weakness again. So she became something else. Not Sith, not Jedi, something colder, more rigid. She became a wall of silence, a keeper of secrets, a white flame that burned without warmth, and all who stood too close felt it. The council felt it too, but by then, it was too late. She no longer listened, no longer compromised, and no longer feared the dark, because she thought she had mastered it. But the dark doesn't make deals. It waits, and once it touches you, it never lets go. Atris thought her robes made her pure, that her silence made her strong. But beneath the fabric, her hands had already begun to shake. The first cells were not made of durasteel. They were made of silence. Atris did not call them prisons. She called them sanctuaries, places of reflection, places of correction, rooms where voices were lowered, where questions were removed, where doubt could be cured. Those who entered were not dragged. They were invited. A request, a summons, a calm order spoken in a gentle tone. They followed because they trusted her, because she wore white, because she spoke of the Jedi Code. The doors closed without a sound. There were no chains, no bars, no guards pacing outside, only quiet walls and time. Atris believed this was mercy. She told herself confinement was better than exile, that isolation could heal corruption, that patience could erase dissent. She watched from a distance, listened through reports, through pauses in the force. Those inside grew still. Some prayed, some meditated, some begged. Atris ignored the pleas. Pleas were emotion. Emotion was weakness. She told herself she was protecting them, protecting the order, protecting the galaxy. But protection that removes choice is something else. The rooms multiplied. One became three. Three became many. Each one designed the same way. Soft light, cold air, nothing sharp, no suffering she could see. That mattered to her, because if she couldn't see pain, then it wasn't really there. She visited once, just once. She stood outside a chamber and listened. Inside, a former Jedi whispered the code. Again and again. His voice was thin, worn. He had asked a question Atris did not like. He had wondered aloud whether the exile was right. That had been enough. Atris felt nothing as she turned away. Not anger, not pity, just resolve. She told herself he would thank her one day. That clarity came through stillness. She told herself many things. The force grew quieter around the chambers. Not dark, not violent, muted, as if it did not want to watch. Those inside began to change. Some stopped speaking. Some stopped reaching out through the force. Some simply faded. Atris called it progress. She wrote reports filled with careful words. Stability, containment, preservation. The council was far away now, busy with survival, busy with rebuilding. They did not ask for details. Atris did not offer them. She learned something important during this time. Chains were unnecessary. Fear was enough. Others noticed what happened to those who questioned her. Not the rooms, not the silence, just the absence afterward. They spoke more carefully, agreed more quickly, lowered their eyes when she passed. Atris interpreted this as unity. Finally, the order was aligned. Finally, there was peace. But peace built on fear does not last. It holds its breath. She walked the halls at night, alone. Her footsteps echoed softly. She told herself she was strong enough to carry this burden, that someone had to make hard choices. That compassion had failed the Jedi before. She would not let it fail them again. Sometimes, in the quiet, she felt something press against her thoughts. A memory, a voice. The exile. Not accusing, not angry, just present. Atris pushed it away. She reminded herself that the exile had walked into exile willingly, that she had chosen distance over duty. Unlike Atris had stayed to clean the ruins, stayed to decide who belonged, stayed to lock the doors. The rooms filled, the silence deepened, and Atris stood at the center of it all, calm and composed. White robes unmarked, hands steady, conviction absolute. She told herself these were not prisons, because prisons are built for enemies, and these people had simply lost their way. She would help them find it again, even if they never left, even if no one ever heard them speak, even if the force itself turned away. Because Atris no longer listened to the force, she listened to order, and order did not argue. It only demanded obedience. The robes were still white, the halls still quiet, but the silence began to change. It wasn't peace anymore. It was something colder. something watching. Atris no longer trusted glances, even from the handmaidens. She told herself they revered her, but reverence can feel like fear, and fear can feel like distance. She walked among them with grace, but not warmth. They bowed lower now, spoke less. Their devotion hadn't changed, but something in her had, and they felt it. Atris didn't notice at first, not clearly, but the air around her began to shift. Even the force around her grew thinner. The light still surrounded her, but it didn't embrace her. It observed, as if uncertain what she had become. She still held the Jedi code, still whispered its words at night, still believed she was saving the Order. But deep inside, a question echoed. When did saving begin to feel like control? She had once wept for the Jedi. Now she ordered them to disappear. She had once feared darkness. Now she spoke with it, not aloud, not in words, but in decisions, in justifications, in the way she buried conscience beneath protocol. She spent hours in her archives, studying holocrons, both Jedi and Sith. At first, she told herself it was for understanding, then for defense, eventually for wisdom. And wisdom, she believed, had no alignment. But knowledge has gravity, and Sith teachings do not sleep. They whisper, they flatter, they echo what you already believe, that you are right, that you are strong enough, that the others are weak. That order must be forced. The words of the Sith didn't shock her anymore. They made sense, in a strange, painful way, not because she agreed, but because she understood. And once understanding replaces fear, there's no barrier left. She didn't feel corrupted. She felt justified. That was the difference. The Jedi feared emotion. The Sith fed on it. Atris denied both. She became something else. Cold, unmoving, calculating. She saw herself as the fulcrum, the balance between past and future, the last true Jedi. But masks, no matter how carefully worn, begin to crack, and hers did. In the quiet hours, in the moments when no one watched, in the flickers of memory she could not suppress. She remembered laughter, the way the exile once laughed, before war. She remembered firelight, and shared silence. Not this silence. That one was warm. This one hurt. She told herself it didn't matter. That memory was weakness. But memory is not a choice. It returns uninvited. She stared into her own reflection one night. Not the robes, not the posture, the eyes. And for the first time, she couldn't tell what she saw. They looked tired. Not from lack of sleep, from something deeper. A soul stretched too thin. A conviction stretched too far. She blinked it away. She straightened her spine. She told herself again, this is necessary. This is duty. This is who I am. But part of her wasn't listening anymore. Part of her was remembering. And part of her was afraid. Because if the mask cracked, what was underneath? Not a Jedi. Not a Sith. Something in between. Something unspoken. Something the Force did not recognize. And perhaps never would again. The archives grew colder. Not in temperature. In presence. What was once a chamber of learning now felt like a vault of secrets. Atris stood at its center, robes still white, heart still hardened. But the weight was different now. Not guilt, not yet, but something like recognition. She didn't speak when she entered the room anymore. She listened. not to the Jedi voices, but to the Sith ones. Their teachings came with venom, but also with clarity. They spoke in certainties, and certainty is seductive. She told herself she was studying them, but she wasn't. She was searching, looking for something to explain why it all fell apart. Why the Order failed, why the wars never stopped, why peace was always an illusion. The Sith answered with brutal honesty. Because peace is a lie. She didn't agree, but the words stayed with her. She began repeating them, silently, alone, testing them, like a blade pressed to skin. Not enough to cut, but enough to feel. The handmaidens noticed her silence. They asked fewer questions. Some avoided her gaze. One left. Atris said nothing. She gave no punishment, no farewell, just silence. Her power didn't need to shout anymore. It was understood. And in that understanding, she began to lose something vital. Connection. Not to control, to compassion. She stopped seeing people, started seeing roles. Obedient, rebellious, useful, dangerous. It was how the Sith saw the galaxy, and Atris hadn't realized how much she agreed. She remembered a moment, years before, a child lost in the archives, curious, laughing. Atris had smiled once. Now she would have had that child removed. Distraction was weakness. Joy was irrelevant. Only control mattered. But control over what? She never asked, because the answer was terrifying. Control over the thing she feared the most herself. The holocrons began to speak in dreams. Not literal voices, but echoes. Flashes of thoughts that weren't hers. Images that lingered after waking. She saw herself in robes of crimson. Saw fire. Felt nothing. And that, more than anything, frightened her. Because in that vision she had no regret. Only resolve. She destroyed that holocron. Burned it. Watched it crack and scream. But it didn't silence the voice. It never does. Once the dark enters, it doesn't knock again. It waits, quietly, patiently. Atris still stood at the edge, but the edge had shifted. What used to be a cliff now felt like a hallway. One step at a time, one choice, one silence, one justification. There was no fall, just descent. And the mask cracked a little more. There was no wind in the Telos Academy, no natural light, just the soft hum of power conduits and the silence that surrounded her like ice. Atris stood alone in the archives, pale robes folded around her like a burial shroud. The flickering glow of holocrons lit her face in flashes of red and gold. Their voices whispered, always whispered, sometimes softly, sometimes louder, but always there. She told herself they were under control, but control was a fragile illusion. For months now, Atris had searched these Sith artifacts for patterns she could weaponize against the enemy. She told herself that studying darkness was a form of protection, that knowledge, even poisonous knowledge, was a tool, that she could remain untouched, that her cause justice made it necessary. But justice had long since become something else. She no longer heard herself speak in the same tone. Her voice was sharper. Her eyes no longer blinked as often. Her steps no longer echoed down the halls with conviction, only with the cold precision of a person who had stopped questioning themselves. She had built this place to be a sanctuary of Jedi purity, but it had become her tomb. And somewhere far beyond the ice walls of Telos, someone was coming. She could feel it, a wound in the Force that never closed, a presence she knew once as a friend, a student, maybe more, maybe something deeper, lost between wars and silence. The Jedi Exile. Atris did not say the name aloud, but the thought clung to her like frost. She remembered her, the one who had left during the Mandalorian Wars, the one who returned now with scars that could not be seen but could be felt like fractures across the Force. Atris had spent years trying to understand how it happened, how one of their most promising had fallen so far, how someone who once stood beside her, shared meals with her, trusted her, could leave them in their darkest hour. But deep down, Atris knew the truth was more complicated than betrayal. She had not been abandoned. She had been afraid. Afraid that the exile had seen something she herself refused to see, that the Jedi Council was paralyzed. That silence had become their only defense against change. That righteousness had turned to cowardice. That wisdom had become an excuse for inaction. And if the exile had been right, then Atris had been wrong. That she could not allow. So she buried it, buried the doubt, the pain, the jealousy. She told herself she was preserving the Jedi way. But in truth, she was preserving herself. It was in this state of stillness, halfway between denial and delusion, that she heard the voice. It did not come through the door. It came through the Force. A whisper, a breath, then a word. Atris. The sound froze her in place, not because it was loud, but because it was unmistakably familiar. She turned, slowly, though no one was there. She looked to the holocrons. They had fallen silent. Then again the voice, closer. You buried yourself in ice to forget the heat of shame. She stepped back. Kreia. But the name was not spoken with hatred. Not yet. There was still something else there. Recognition. Even a flicker of guilt. Kreia. Not Darth Atris. Not yet. That title would come later. This was the woman who had once taught Atris, who had sat across from her in the archives of Coruscant, debating Jedi dogma with the gentleness of a mentor and the sharpness of a blade. This was the woman Atris had once admired, feared, and betrayed. You've spent too long listening to voices that only tell you what you want to hear, the voice whispered. Atris clenched her jaw. I listen for truth, she answered. Then why do you fear it? Silence. The walls of the academy felt smaller now. Kreia's voice was not angry. It was not mocking. It was tired. As if she had already won the argument. As if there was nothing left to prove. You saw the truth once, Kreia said. In her. In the exile. That's why you hate her. Atris did not reply. Because there was no reply that didn't shatter something. I do not hate her, she finally whispered. Kreia's voice was like wind through dry leaves. No. You hate what she reminds you of. What you lost. Atris turned away from the holocrons. She walked down the corridor, slow and unsteady, as if she were descending deeper into herself. The academy had no mirrors. She made sure of that. But the Force was a mirror. And Kreia was holding it up to her. You cling to robes and rules like their armor, Kreia said, her voice now inside Atris's thoughts. But they do not protect you. They only disguise the fear. Atris reached the meditation chamber. She sat, and for the first time in years, she closed her eyes without pretending to be at peace. The voice of Kreia lingered, not with power, but with pity, and that, more than anything, terrified her, because it meant Kreia had already seen the end. The air in the Telos Academy was always cold, but that day it felt colder. Atris sat in the stillness of the meditation chamber, but she was not meditating. Her posture was rigid, her eyes half open. The light from the ceiling pulsed softly against the durasteel walls, casting shadows that seemed to lean toward her. She was alone, but not truly. The voice had not returned, but its absence was just as loud. Kriya had not confronted her in the physical sense. She did not walk through the doors or ignite a lightsaber. No, her presence had come like a whisper in the dark, subtle, precise, undeniable. The kind of voice that didn't need volume to wound. Atris breathed slowly, but her thoughts moved like fire through dry leaves. Why now? Why her? She had buried Kriya long ago, buried the woman and the memories with her. When the Jedi exiled her, Atris had voted with the rest, perhaps more eagerly than most. She had believed it necessary, a clean severing of a rotting limb. But exile was not silence, not for someone like Kriya. Atris had once believed she knew what darkness was, that it came in the form of violence, red blades, and monstrous intentions. But Kriya had always been something else, something more dangerous. Her teachings were not dark, they were unsettling. They questioned things Atris had sworn to never question, like duty, like certainty, like the idea that the Jedi were always right. And now that voice had returned, not to tempt her, but to reflect her. That was the worst part. Kriya had always seen her too clearly. There was a time, long ago, when Atris had admired that clarity. She had even sought it. She remembered sitting across from her former master, her young face bright with questions, her heart full of ideals. "How does one stay pure?" she had once asked. Kriya had smiled, but it had not been a kind smile. "You don't," she had said. "You only delay the realization that you were never pure to begin with." Atris had hated that answer. She still did. It was easier to believe that her path had been clean, that her robes meant something, that she had never strayed, only others had. But the truth was buried in ice, and Kriya had started melting it. Atris stood. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't sit still. Her feet carried her through the empty corridors of the academy, past the locked chambers, past the student quarters that had been silent for years, and finally, to the holocron vault. She hesitated, then entered. The room pulsed with a quiet hum. Shelves lined the walls, each one filled with dark relic Sith holocrons taken from ruins, stolen from tombs, or captured during the Jedi Civil War. Each one a voice, a mind, a memory. She had told herself they were secured, watched, controlled. But now, she wasn't so sure. As she stepped closer, one activated on its own. Red light spilled across her face. A projection emerged, the flickering image of an ancient Sith Lord, long dead, his eyes hollow with cruelty. "The Jedi fear knowledge," the voice rasped, "because knowledge reveals their lies." Atris did not flinch. This was not new. She had heard this holocron speak many times. But today, it felt like it wasn't just the Sith speaking. It was Kriya, or worse, it was her. She reached forward. Her fingers hovered just inches from the artifact's surface, and for a moment she saw herself reflected there, not as she was, but as something else. Her white robe stained with blood, her eyes darkened by conviction, her lips moving, not in prayer, but in justification. She pulled her hand away. She exited the vault and sealed it behind her. But the image followed her. As she walked back toward the central hall, the vision would not fade. Not just the vision of herself, but of Kriya. Not crier as she had been on Coruscant, or even crier as she had become in the shadows, but crier as a mirror, a future. What if that was her path? What if she was already walking it? No lightsaber, no declaration of allegiance, just slow steps toward something irreversible. She told herself she was different, but Kreia had once believed that too. That night, Atris did not sleep. She sat alone in her private chamber, the room barely lit. Her data terminals blinked with unread messages. Her records were incomplete, her archives untouched, her mind louder than ever. And the question returned, not from Kreia, from within. What had she become? Was she still Jedi? Was she anything? In the silence, she reached for an old recording. A message sent by the Jedi Council years ago, a final ruling on the exile's punishment. She listened to it again. The words were sharp, clear, delivered without hesitation. But they sounded hollow now. She wondered how many times Kreia had listened to that same message. How many times she had played it back in her mind. Not to find fault, but to understand how they could cut so cleanly. And then she wondered if she had done the same. To the exile, to Kreia, to herself. The cold never left Telos. But tonight, it wasn't just the wind. It was something breaking. Something Atris had kept locked for far too long. And now, it had finally begun to open. It was not a duel. It was a reckoning. When the exile arrived on Telos, the academy felt different. The air shifted, the silence bent inward. Even the light dimmed, as if the force itself was holding its breath. Somewhere deep inside, Atris knew this moment would come. She had seen it in her dreams, buried beneath layers of denial. But she never imagined it would feel like this. She had prepared for confrontation, for accusations, for some grand pronouncement of betrayal. What she hadn't prepared for was the quiet. The exile did not come to judge her. She came to understand. That, more than anything, unraveled Atris. They stood in the white halls of the Telos Academy. Two women, shaped by the same war, shattered by different wounds. There was no music, no fury, just the echo of footsteps and the heaviness of things unspoken. "You've changed," Atris said first. Her voice was tight, almost cold. "You carry darkness." The exile didn't deny it. "I carry what I had to," she replied. "What was left behind." Atris clenched her fists, her tone sharpened. "You turned your back on the Jedi, on all of us. And now you return as, what, a savior?" But there was no heat behind the words. Only grief. Because somewhere inside, Atris still remembered a time before the war. A time when the exile had laughed in the gardens of the Jedi Temple. When they had walked together beneath the glow of Coruscant's spires, talking about justice and peace like it was something real. They had been close, closer than Atris admitted to anyone. Perhaps closer than Jedi were allowed to be. That's why it hurt. That's why she had voted for her exile. Not out of loyalty to the council, but out of betrayal. She had felt abandoned. And now, standing face to face, the wound opened again. "I did what I thought was right," the exile said quietly, "and I lived with the silence it brought." Atris looked away. "You think you understand what I've become," she said. But the exile didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth was visible in Atris's eyes, in the way her posture tensed, in the shadow that clung to her aura like frost. She had spent years hiding in white robes, cloaking her darkness in the language of order. But the illusion had cracks, and Kreia had broken them open. You kept Sith holocrons, the exile said softly. You listened to them. Atris stiffened. For knowledge, she snapped. To understand our enemy. To protect the Jedi from another fall. But they changed you. The silence between them deepened. Atris had no answer. Because the truth had never been about protection. It had been about control, about power, about wanting to never feel helpless again. And that desire had roots far older than the Academy on Telos. It had started when she lost Kreia. It grew when she lost the Exile. And it hardened when she was left alone to rebuild what little remained of the Jedi Order. She had spoken of purity, but her hands were not clean. You don't know what it's like, Atris whispered, to be left with nothing but ruins, to carry the weight of an entire order, with no one to trust, no one to guide you. I do, the exile said gently. I carried it too, alone, across the void, across wars, across death. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the Force surged not violently, but mournfully. A tide of memory, of loss, of once shared purpose that had decayed into bitterness. You think Kreia sent me? The exile asked. Atris didn't answer, but the question struck deep, because in some way, she had always known this confrontation wasn't just about the two of them. Kreia's presence lingered. Her shadow touched every word, every thought, every moment. Kreia had never needed to raise a hand. She simply planted seeds, and now they were blooming. I came to find her, the exile continued, but instead I found you. The words hung heavy in the air, because in truth they were one and the same. Both had been mentors. Both had lost themselves to visions of the galaxy. Both had believed they were saving others when they could barely save themselves. I don't hate you, the exile said. Atris turned away. But I hate myself. The admission broke something, not in the Force, but in her. For the first time in years, Atris felt something crack behind her eyes. The walls she had built, the righteous fury, the purity, the control, all began to crumble, and beneath it was just a woman. Tired, lonely, ashamed. She didn't fall to her knees. She didn't beg forgiveness. That wasn't her way. But the silence that followed was more honest than any defense she could have offered. The exile didn't press further. She simply stepped back, offered space, offered dignity, and with that, the moment passed. Not as a victory, but as a pause between past and future, between what was and what might still be. As the exile turned to leave, Atris remained in the hall, still, silent, and somewhere far away, Kreia smiled. Because this was never about redemption. It was about truth. And truth, once spoken, cannot be unsaid. Atris didn't speak for a long time after the exile left. The academy was quiet again, but it wasn't peace. She walked slowly through the hallways, robes trailing behind her, as if the silence could shield her from what she now understood. The walls were too white, too empty, too perfect. They reminded her of how far she had drifted, not toward darkness, but toward something colder. Not a Sith, not a Jedi, something in between, something unspoken. That was what Kreia had seen. That was why she had never tried to destroy Atris. She didn't need to. All she had to do was wait. Atris had built this place as a monument, a symbol of purity. But in the end, it had become a tomb, not of bodies but of illusions. Every step she took echoed with lies she once told herself. That she was saving the Jedi, that her isolation was wisdom, that knowledge was control. But Kreia had shattered all of it, not with lightning, not with sabers, but with a single idea. You are who you deny. That was the voice Atris couldn't forget. It didn't haunt her like a ghost. It lingered like a wound, not bleeding, but always sore. Every time she tried to justify herself, that voice returned, calm, disappointed, dissecting her thoughts before they even finished forming. She had spent years in that voice's shadow, not because Kreia had power over her, but because Kreia understood her. More than the Council ever did, more than the Exile ever could. Because Kreia, too, had walked the line between light and dark. She had loved the Jedi, then hated them, then mourned them. Her fall wasn't born of ambition. It was born of grief, and Atris finally saw it. That was the revelation. It didn't come in fire or death or triumph. It came in stillness, in the mirror, because what Atris had become was what she had once feared. She was the hypocrite, the zealot, the one who thought she could wield darkness without being touched by it. The one who dismissed warnings, silenced doubts, and pushed away everyone who might have pulled her back. She remembered her younger self, arrogant, passionate, pure. That version of her had died on Qatar. She just didn't realize it until now. She returned to the vault beneath the academy, the place where the Sith holocrons were kept. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at them. Their glow pulsed softly, red, tempting, familiar. But they didn't speak to her anymore. Not because their voices were silent, but because she no longer needed them. She knelt before them, not to worship, not to destroy, just to acknowledge. She had built this sanctum with pride, with fear, with desperation. And now, all that remained was understanding. She was never immune to the dark side. She had just been better at hiding it. Atris reached out her hand and closed the holocron, one by one. No flames, no rituals, just closure. Outside, the wind howled across the surface of Telos. The ice didn't care what wars were fought beneath it, or what truths were buried. It simply remained cold and unmoved, just like she had once tried to be. But now, she wasn't. Something had changed. She didn't fall, not like Malak, not like Nihilus. She didn't rise either, not like the Exile, not like Revan. She simply stood still, and sometimes that's more dangerous. The galaxy didn't hear about what happened on Telos. The Jedi who would later rebuild the Order never spoke her name. The war moved on, the Republic healed, and yet, in that frozen academy, a choice was made, quietly, without audience, without glory. Atris didn't return to the Council. She didn't chase the Exile. She didn't join Kreia. She stayed. Because sometimes the only way forward is to sit with the damage, to not run, to not fight, to not justify. Just sit and listen. She kept the academy open, but not as a temple, as a reminder, to herself, to anyone who came after, a place where purity failed, and where truth began. In time, she would teach again. But not with certainty, not with arrogance. She would speak of mistakes, of silence, of exile. She would never claim to be right again, only honest. And though her name would fade from history, her lessons would not. Because the ones who fall in silence often leave the loudest echoes. And somewhere in the unknown regions, far from Telos, far from the core, far from memory, Kreia smiled. She had not needed to win, only to be understood. That was her real legacy. Not destruction, not redemption, but reflection. The mirror did not shatter all at once. It cracked, Slowly, Atris stood alone in the academy, surrounded by walls that no longer answered her. The holocrons were sealed, the corridors empty. The silence was complete. Not the silence of peace, the silence of something finished. For the first time, there was no voice guiding her. Not the Sith, not the Jedi, not even Kriya. Only herself. And that was unbearable. She had spent years defining herself through opposition, against the exile, against Kriya, against the weakness she believed had destroyed the Order. But now, there was no enemy left to fight. Only a reflection. She walked through the halls slowly, her steps measured, as if discipline could still anchor her. The white robes felt heavier now. Not sacred, not proud. Exposed. She passed chambers she had sealed. Rooms where voices had faded into nothing. Rooms she had justified as necessary. Necessary was the word she clung to. Everything had been necessary. The silence followed her. It did not accuse. It did not forgive. It waited. Atris entered the central hall and stopped. This was where she had spoken with authority, where others had listened, where fear had dressed itself as obedience. She remembered standing here, issuing commands without hesitation, believing certainty was strength, believing doubt was corruption. She remembered the way others had looked at her, not with love, not with trust, with caution. That memory hurt more than she expected. She sat down slowly, lowering herself to the cold floor. Not in meditation, just sitting. She had not done that in years. Meditation required purpose. Stillness required honesty. And honesty was what she had avoided. Her thoughts began to surface, not as screams, as fragments. The exile's eyes, not angry, disappointed. Krea's voice, not cruel, patient, and beneath them both, a quieter truth. She had not been strong. She had been afraid. Afraid of loss. Afraid of irrelevance. Afraid that without the Order, she was nothing. So, she had clung to it, tightened her grip, until it broke. Atris pressed her hands against the floor. The stone was cold, real, unmoving, unlike everything she had believed in. She had called herself a guardian of purity, but purity had been a shield. She had called herself a judge, but judgment had been easier than mercy. She had called herself a Jedi, but the Force had withdrawn from her long before she admitted it. That realization settled heavily in her chest. She did not cry. Not yet, because tears require release. And Atris still resisted letting go. She stood again and walked toward the sealed vaults. Her steps were slower now, less certain. She opened a chamber she had not entered since the confrontation. Inside, nothing waited for her. No holocrons, no answers, only absence. She had removed the darkness, but she had removed herself with it. The room felt hollow, like her. Atris leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. She remembered who she had been. Not the archivist, not the judge, the girl who believed knowledge could save the galaxy, the woman who believed the Order could endure, the friend who once laughed quietly in the temple halls. That version of herself felt distant, almost fictional. She wondered when she lost her. There was no single moment, no fall, just a series of choices, each one justified, each one defended, until there was nothing left to defend. Her reflection had not broken in rage. It had dissolved, piece by piece. Atris opened her eyes. For the first time, she did not try to rebuild the image. She let it remain broken. because only broken things can be examined honestly. She walked back into the central hall and stood beneath the lights. No council watched her. No students listened. No one waited for guidance. She was alone with the truth. And the truth was simple. She had lost everything she claimed to protect. Not to the Sith, not to war, to herself. The realization did not come with despair. It came with clarity, painful, quiet. Atris did not know what came next. She only knew what was gone. The certainty, the authority, the illusion. And as the silence closed around her once more, it felt different. Not like a weapon, like a mirror. And this time, she did not look away. The Force had not left her. She had left the Force. It was a truth Atris had buried beneath logic, discipline, and denial. For years, she had believed she still walked its path. That her judgment was clear, that her purpose was righteous. But the Force had grown quiet, and now she understood why. The white walls around her had once felt like armor, symbols of her devotion. Now they echoed like tombstones, cold reminders of a life spent chasing perfection and punishing imperfection, especially her own. She wandered through the academy like a shadow. No students remained. No masters walked its halls. Only her, and the weight of choices that could not be undone. Every room whispered. Every silence accused. This place had once been a temple, then a prison, then a mirror. And Atris could not decide which truth was worse. In the meditation chamber, she lowered herself to the floor again. But this time, there was no ritual, no attempt to control her thoughts. She just sat and listened to memory, to failure, to the voice she had once silenced. Kreia. That name no longer stung the way it used to, because Atris finally understood what she had faced. Not a Sith, not a monster, a wound, a reflection. Kreia had never spoken with hate, only disappointment. Her voice, even at its most venomous, had been calm, measured, like someone who had already accepted how the story ends. Atris had not listened then, because listening would have meant doubt, and doubt was something she couldn't afford. Not when she had already condemned so many. Not when she had built her entire identity on the illusion of certainty. She opened her eyes and looked at her hands. They trembled now, not from weakness, from remembering. The datapads she had destroyed, the prisoners she had justified, the truths she had rewritten. She thought of the exile again. Their reunion had not been violent, not even cruel, just silent. Two people who once trusted each other, now strangers. The exile had seen her, not as a villain, not even as an enemy, just a tragedy. Atris remembered the way they had looked at her, with pain, with memory, with loss, and still, with hope, a hope she had rejected, because accepting it would mean opening herself to grief, and grief was dangerous. Grief could shatter the walls she had spent years building, but those walls were already gone. She stood and walked deeper into the archives. Many of the records had been sealed by her own order. Some were too dangerous, others too honest. She opened one, a recording from before the war. Her voice, younger, warmer, filled with idealism. "We must preserve truth," the voice said. "We must never fear knowledge." She turned it off, because that voice wasn't hers anymore. Or maybe it was, and she had just forgotten it. She stepped back, unsure what she was searching for. And then she realized she wasn't searching for answers. She was mourning the questions she had stopped asking. What does it mean to be a Jedi? What does it mean to protect, to serve, to understand? She had replaced those questions with orders, directives, absolute truths, because it was easier to follow rules than to face uncertainty. But now, she lived inside uncertainty, and the rules no longer applied. Atris made her way to the council chamber long abandoned, stripped of authority. The circle of chairs still stood, empty, waiting. She did not sit in the center. She stood outside the ring, where the Padawans once stood, and she whispered the words she hadn't said in years. I was wrong. The sound barely echoed, but it was enough. For the first time, she felt the Force stir, not as approval, as acknowledgement. The Force did not punish. It waited, and now it waited no longer. It returned not with warmth, but with weight. It pressed against her, quiet and constant, like the memory of someone who had been standing beside her the whole time. Atris closed her eyes and let the silence speak. She did not try to shape it. She did not try to control it. She let it be. And within it, she found something she had forgotten. Not power, not purpose, presence. She was here, and she was still alive. And that meant something. Not everything could be undone. Not every scar could fade. But some truths, once admitted, could begin to heal. She stepped out of the council chamber, not with certainty, but with awareness. Her story wasn't over, but the chapter that defined her by denial was. Atris had not fallen. That was the lie she told herself for years. She had watched Sith lords rise in flame, Jedi turn in rage, heroes collapse under their own hunger. Her story was different, was dense. She did not leap into darkness. She sank, slowly, without resistance, like someone who steps into deep water believing they can still touch the ground. At first, she had felt in control. Every choice measured. Every decision justified. She told herself that falling meant losing discipline. She had never lost discipline. That was the problem. Discipline became her anchor, and her weight. She walked the outer corridors of the academy now, where the ice pressed closest against the walls. Beyond the transparent steel, Telos stretched endlessly, white, silent, uncaring. She placed her hand against the cold surface. It burned. She welcomed the pain, because pain meant she could still feel something. She remembered the first time she realized she was alone. Not after the war, not after the council fractured, but after the last person stopped questioning her. That silence had felt like victory. Now it felt like drowning. Drowning is not violent. It is heavy. It is slow. Your limbs grow weak. Your thoughts narrow. Your world shrinks to breath and pressure. Atris had drowned beneath her own reflection. Every time she looked at herself, she saw what she wanted to see. A protector, a judge, a guardian of what remained. She never saw the water rising, because it looked like order. She had not lost herself in anger. She had lost herself in certainty. She had believed that to hesitate was to fail. That mercy was weakness. That understanding was dangerous. So she removed those things, piece by piece, until all that remained was function. She stopped asking why. She only asked how. How to contain, how to silence, how to preserve. And when you stop asking why, you stop being human. Atris leaned her forehead against the cold wall. Her breath fogged the surface. She watched it fade, again and again. Temporary. Like everything she had built, she thought of the exile, not as an enemy, not even as a reminder, but as a contrast. The exile had lost the force and survived. Atris had kept it and hollowed herself. The difference haunted her. One had let go. The other had clenched until nothing moved. She wondered what would have happened if she had spoken, if she had questioned the council instead of agreeing, if she had reached out instead of closing doors. There were no answers now, only consequences. She had not been struck down, not punished, not cast out. She had simply been left behind. And perhaps that was worse. The academy no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a husk. She moved through it without direction, until she found herself in a chamber she had sealed long ago. Inside were the remains of personal effects, belongings taken from those she had confined. A datapad, a broken focus crystal, a simple piece of cloth. She picked up the cloth. It was folded carefully, respectfully. That made her chest tighten. She had told herself she treated them with dignity, that she never crossed certain lines, but dignity without freedom is still a cage. Atris sat down among the forgotten objects. She did not catalogue them, did not justify them. She let them exist, and in doing so, she allowed something else to surface. Grief, not explosive, not dramatic, just heavy. Grief for the people she had silenced, for the paths she had closed, for the person she had been. Tears came then, quietly, unnoticed. They fell onto the cold floor and vanished, like everything else. Atris did not wipe them away. She let them fall. She had spent so long refusing to sink. Now she realized something. Drowning was not the end. It was the moment you stopped fighting the truth. She had drowned beneath reflection. But reflection could also show you the surface. If you dared to look up, Atris stood slowly. Her body felt lighter, not because she was free, because she had stopped pretending she wasn't trapped. She did not know how to rise. Not yet. But she knew one thing with certainty. She would never wear certainty like armor again, because it had almost killed her. And as she left the chamber, the silence followed. Not as a threat, as a witness. She returned to the central chamber one final time, the place where it had all begun, where her decisions had echoed across lives, where justice and fear had become the same voice in her head. The circle was empty now. No council, no prisoners, no whispers of protocol. Only memory, and memory had weight. She stepped into the center, stood in the very place where the exile had once faced her. Back then, she had looked down with authority, spoken with ice, believed she was right. Now she looked up and saw herself for the first time. Not the High Counselor, not the last voice of the Jedi, just a woman who had been afraid to lose control. It wasn't the galaxy she had feared. It was what she might become without rules, without identity, without a mask. The quiet deepened. She let it settle around her like a shroud. There was no dramatic collapse, no explosion of force energy, just acceptance. And in that stillness came the voice. Not from outside, not from Trier, not from the past. From within, small, tired, but honest. It asked a question she had silenced for too long. What do you want to be? Not what she was taught, not what the code expected, not what the archives demanded. Just her. The answer didn't come right away, but the question remained. And that was enough. She walked the corridors again, but this time, with no destination, no performance, no fear, just movement. The academy no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a ruin, and ruins could be rebuilt, not restored, not copied, rebuilt, different. She passed the chamber where the Sith holocrons had once been locked. She didn't stop. She didn't destroy them either. She simply closed the door. Because some things don't need to be used or erased. They just need to be left behind. Outside, the wind howled against the outer walls. But inside, there was a fragile peace. She gathered her old robes. The white ones. The ones she had worn to prove she was untouched by the dark. She folded them slowly, carefully, and then laid them down. Not with anger, with respect, because even masks, once removed, deserve to be buried. Atris had not died. She had not been redeemed. She had simply awakened. Awakening is not loud. It is not glorious. It is quiet, lonely, but it is also the first step. The exile had survived without the Force. Atris would have to survive without illusion. She would remain on Telos, not as a warden, not as a Jedi, but as a keeper of silence, a witness to her own undoing. The academy would remain as well, not because it deserved to, but because forgetting was just another lie. Let the walls stand. Let the halls echo. Let the ice remind her, every day, of what happens when you stop listening. She stood at the outer edge of the structure as the storm rolled across the horizon. The light was dim, the wind sharp, but she did not turn away. She had turned away for too long. Now, she would watch. The galaxy would move on without her. Wars would come and go. Names would rise and fall. The Jedi would fade, return, and fade again. But none of it mattered here. Here, there was only breath. Cold, clear, unfiltered. She inhaled deeply, not to center herself, but to begin again. The Force moved around her now, not through her, not because of her, just around. She did not reach for it. She simply let it be. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel silent. It felt still. There is a difference. She had learned that too late, but late was still better than never. She sat beneath the archway of the main gate, crossed her legs, closed her eyes. Not to meditate, just to rest. There were no more battles, no more sentences to pass, no more images to uphold, just a long, slow exhale, and the quiet hum of her own heart slowly learning to speak again. Atris had not fallen. She had shattered. And now she gathered the pieces, not to rebuild who she was, but to see finally what lay beneath the mask she once called truth. And in that brokenness, she was free. There was no warmth in those halls anymore, no breath, no voice, only stone and silence. Telos had been rebuilt, the surface reborn from ash and war, but beneath it, buried deep in the foundations of the old republic, the hidden academy remained untouched. A place not of learning but of forgetting, and in that forgotten place lived Atris. She no longer wore the white robes of judgment. They had yellowed over time, dulled by dust and memory. She no longer stood tall with the poise of a council member. Her shoulders curved now, bent inward as if she were holding something heavy inside. She rarely spoke, and when she did, it wasn't to people. It was to echoes. Sometimes she whispered to holocrons, sometimes to her own reflection, but most of the time, she said nothing at all. because there was no one left to hear her. Once she had claimed to preserve knowledge, to protect the wisdom of the Jedi Order. But now, the library around her felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. The teachings she had guarded so fiercely no longer served anyone. The war had moved on. The galaxy had moved on. She hadn't. There were moments she would replay in her mind over and over again. The steps that led her here. Not just the betrayal of the exile, but the betrayal of herself. She remembered how she had imprisoned those she considered allies, how she had lied to herself, believing control was peace, that silence was order. She had thought she could walk the path of the Sith without becoming one, that she could use their tools without losing her soul. She was wrong, but no one told her, no one stopped her. And now there was no one left to forgive her. The others were gone. The handmaidens had left, one by one, some to follow the exile, others to chase meaning elsewhere in the galaxy. Even their voices, once strict and cold, had carried life, discipline, direction. Without them, the academy felt larger, emptier. The hum of the security systems, the flicker of the lights, they echoed through the hallways like distant ghosts. And still, she stayed. It wasn't out of penance. Atris had never believed in punishment, not for herself. It wasn't out of fear either. She wasn't afraid to die. She was afraid to matter again. Because to matter meant to choose, to stand for something, to risk falling again. And she was tired of falling. So she sat, alone, among the dying knowledge of a broken order. She listened to recordings she had once played with pride, the words of Jedi masters, long dead, their teachings now brittle with time. She no longer corrected them, no longer debated them. She simply let them play and fade. Sometimes the sound of her own breath startled her. It was the only proof she still lived. She no longer dreamed, not of the council, not of the exile, not even of the past. Her mind had become quiet, too quiet. There were days, perhaps weeks, where she didn't move at all. Just sat in the center of the archive chamber, knees drawn in, eyes open, waiting for a reason to rise. No one came. No voices called her. And the galaxy, in all its noise and violence, had finally left her behind. But in that stillness, in that terrible silence, something deeper was beginning to form. Not redemption, not revelation, just a question she had buried long ago. And now, it was whispering back. She began to notice it in small ways. The way doors no longer recognized her presence at first. The way lights hesitated before turning on. The way the archive systems took longer to respond. The academy was forgetting her. Atris moved through the halls like a shadow that had lost its owner. Her footsteps made sound, but they carried no authority now. No one turned. No one listened. The silence did not obey her anymore. Once, this place had bent around her will. Now, it barely acknowledged she existed. She stopped entering the central chambers. Those rooms remembered too much. Instead, she lived among the shelves, between rows of data crystals and inactive holocrons. Knowledge stacked upon knowledge, all preserved for a future that did not include her. She had become part of the archive, not a keeper, an artifact. Sometimes she would catch her reflection in the polished surfaces of sealed consoles. Pale, still, almost unreal. She looked like a projection that had forgotten how to fade. She wondered how long it would take before the systems began to classify her as obsolete. She did not resist the thought. There were moments when she spoke aloud, testing her voice. It sounded thinner than she remembered, as if it had passed through too much quiet. She would ask questions she no longer expected answers to. What remains of a Jedi when belief is gone? What remains of duty when no one is watching? The walls did not answer. She began to sleep less, not because of fear, because there was nothing left to wake up from. Dreams had abandoned her, just as the Force had pulled away, not in rejection, in indifference. That hurt more than exile ever had. She remembered how she once feared being forgotten. Now she understood it. Forgetting was gentle. It asked nothing of her. No judgment, no forgiveness, no return, just absence. Occasionally, travelers passed through Telos above. She felt their presence faintly through the Force, blurred impressions, lives continuing, choices being made. None of them reached down here. No one came looking for Atris. The Jedi rebuilding elsewhere spoke of new beginnings, new teachings, new failures waiting to happen. Her name did not appear in their records, not as a warning, not as a lesson. She had been edited out. Atris sat among the shelves one evening, her back against a pillar etched with symbols she had once memorized. She traced them with her fingers, not to remember their meaning, but to remember touch. She thought of the exile again, not with bitterness, with distance. The exile had carried exile and survived it, had found meaning in loss, had walked forward while Atris stayed behind, guarding ruins that no longer mattered. She wondered if the exile ever thought of her, not as an enemy, as a footnote. The thought settled quietly. She was not angry. Anger required energy. She was simply fading. The academy lights dimmed automatically as she remained still. Energy conservation protocols did not account for occupants who did not move. Atris watched the shadows stretch across the floor. For a moment, she imagined disappearing completely, becoming nothing more than a rumor attached to an abandoned structure beneath ice. The idea did not frighten her. It felt earned. She closed her eyes, and for a heartbeat, she felt something stir. Not the Force, not memory. Awareness. She was still here, still breathing, still choosing to remain. And that meant something. Even if no one else remembered her, even if the archive listed her as irrelevant, ghosts still linger for a reason. They are reminders. And Atris, standing silent among forgotten knowledge, had become one. She heard her voice before she recognized it. The old recordings echoed through the empty halls like ghosts, not holocrons, not Sith illusions. They were real. Preserved fragments of her former self, locked away in the archives she once guarded like sacred fire. She would walk past them now and feel nothing, until she didn't. Until the echo of her own words struck something deep inside her that she could no longer name. I am Atris, Jedi Master, historian, keeper of truth. That voice belonged to someone else. It wasn't shame that silenced her, not anymore. Shame had long since burned itself into something colder. She no longer felt the wound of her fall. She had bled it dry. Now, all that remained was the aftermath. Stillness, silence, the sound of old truths unraveling in a dead temple where no one would come looking. The Jedi were gone, not all of them, but the ones who had once stood beside her, Vrook, Kavar, Zez-Kael, they were dead. Their voices lost to war and consequence. She had outlived them all. Not through victory, not through wisdom, but through retreat, through fear. Atris had imagined her exile as temporary, once, a period of study, a meditation. She had convinced herself she was preserving the Jedi Order by withdrawing from it, that she was protecting its teachings. But now, years later, she couldn't even remember the moment that lie became truth in her mind. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped asking. The academy on Telos had become a monument to that silence. The lights still worked. The consoles still flickered with power. But it was not alive. It was not a sanctuary. It was a tomb. And she was the last echo inside it. Even the holocrons refused to speak now. There had been a time when she had surrounded herself with Sith knowledge under the pretense of understanding it, resisting it. She had believed she could stare into the abyss without falling. But the abyss had never needed to drag her down. It had simply waited for her to fall inward, piece by piece, one compromise at a time. And so she stayed here. Not as a prisoner, not even as a penitent. There was no one left to judge her. No council, no students, no Force ghost whispering from the shadows. Only memories. She remembered the face of the exile more clearly now than she had during their confrontation. That final conversation had not been a trial. It had been a mirror. And in that mirror, Atris had seen the one thing she had spent her whole life avoiding herself. Beneath the pride, beneath the robes, beneath the mask of duty and structure, she had seen the girl who had once believed in peace, in justice, in something greater. That girl had begged for silence when the wars began, and Atris had silenced her forever. She had betrayed that child long before she betrayed the Jedi. Now, the only witness to that crime was the Force itself, and even it had grown quiet. Some days she wondered if she still had the strength to leave, to walk out beneath the cold skies of Telos and vanish into the galaxy like so many broken Force sensitives before her. She could find another world, another name, another life. But she didn't move, not because she was afraid. Not anymore, but because deep down she believed this was where she belonged, not as punishment, but as truth. She had tried to preserve the Jedi. Instead, she had become their final warning. Alone, watching, remembering, a silent archivist in a galaxy that had already turned the page. The Jedi Temple on Telos was no longer a place of learning. It was a crypt. No voices echoed through its marble halls. No footsteps stirred the dust that clung to its stone. Only Atris remained, not as a master, not as a prisoner, but as something else. A presence without purpose. She wandered the archives like a shade, passing shelves she had once curated, passing holocrons that once held her faith. Now they spoke nothing, and neither did she. She had spent decades chasing control of knowledge, control of the Jedi, control of herself. But the truth was colder than any exile. She had never been in control, only afraid. Afraid to feel, afraid to lose, afraid to be wrong. So she buried her doubts in data, her fears in silence, and her failures in righteousness. But silence was never safety. It only made the guilt louder. She replayed old conversations in her head. With the exile, with Kriya, with herself. And each time, her words sounded thinner. Each argument weaker. Each lie clearer. She remembered saying the dark side had not touched her, that her actions were pure, that the ends justified the means. But deep down she had known that the robes she wore meant nothing, known that the color of a lightsaber did not absolve the hand that held it. She had blamed Revan, blamed the Mandalorian wars, blamed the exile. But it was never them. It was her. She had chosen silence not to meditate, but to avoid the sound of her own heart breaking. Because she had loved, and she had lost, and she had never forgiven herself for either. She thought detachment would make her strong, that love was weakness, that distance was clarity, but all it gave her was an empty room, and the sound of her own breathing, and the memory of a woman she used to be. Sometimes she would activate the old recordings, not to study them, but to remember the faces. Jedi she had once called friends, students she had once guided, lovers she had once denied, and she would sit among them, listening to voices that no longer answered, whispers trapped in glass. This was her penance, to live among ghosts, to be forgotten but never gone. She did not seek redemption. She did not seek death. Only stillness, only understanding, because somewhere, deep inside her, a part of her still believed the Jedi could be more. That knowledge could still serve peace. That silence could still teach. But it was not her time anymore. Not her voice the galaxy needed. Not her light that would guide the next. And so she faded. Not in body, but in memory. Her name was no longer spoken. Her deeds no longer debated. Her failures no longer feared. She became a myth without myth, a Jedi without a story, a woman without a name, and that perhaps was mercy, because in that silence, the silence she chose, she finally found peace. Not the kind promised by the Jedi Code, not the kind bought by victory, but the kind that comes when everything else is gone, and all that remains is the truth. And the truth was simple. She had been Atris. She had tried to save the Order, and in doing so, she had lost herself. But even in that loss, she left behind something more valuable than any doctrine. A warning that the light is not what you wear, it's what you face. Even when you face yourself,